Okay, welcome everybody to, I can't even remember how many of our OD talks, like 22 or something, I think at the moment. Somewhere around there. We've been doing them since middle of April, I think, when we decided that we miss our OD cafes too much and we still need to do something to bring people together and learn together and pick each other's brains and challenge and debate. So today we have a very interesting topic. And it came about from our team challenging Christo to take on this topic. Because we in the OD world, and I'm sure a lot of you have experienced this, have so many clients that always says it has to be customized. We're different. Our company is different. There's nothing the same. And you've got this balancing act of, it's much more expensive for the client and much more time consuming for us to redesign everything. But then there is some value in it. But there's also value in the off-the-shelf stuff. And we at Willsview Academy know that and have been doing that and appreciate that. So we thought, let's have that conversation. Willsview Academy came really into fruition. It used to be a HR consultancy, but when it really became an OD firm was when a family member of Craig Yateman, our founder, who was at that point the HR exec of a big company based in America, came to Craig and said, there's no rapidly scalable, deployable leadership development intervention in the world that she can find. Can we create one? And Craig took up the challenge and got lots of experts and clever people together, and they created what is now known as 9 Conversations in Leadership. Still used, still appreciated, still loved all over the world. We still have clients in Australia, in all over Africa, the UK, even training academies in the UK using 9 Conversations in Leadership, people in South Africa. Interesting experience, somebody who worked in Willsview Academy, some of you might remember her, Fiona McFarlane. She was part of Willsview for 7 or 8 years and then moved to KZN and started working for a large company who's in the hotel and timeshare business. And she wanted to do leadership development there. And she went looking. And she said, she came to us eventually and said, I had to do my due diligence because I can't just automatically go for 9C because I know 9 Conversations in Leadership. I had to go and prove to myself that this really is what I need. And it is really what I need. And they've continued to do 54 of their leaders through 9C, and they're loving it, and it's working. So it came about that we said to Christo, come on, Christo, we're having this debate, and we need to keep having it and figure it out. What sits in that off-the-shelf thing, and what is this OD process that we think we're so good at, and that brings the conversations and the customization into the room? So, Christo, over to you.
Thank you, Liesl.
Really looking forward to this.
It's an interesting challenge, and I wonder if I have addressed it, because of course, you know, I always sit with this particular challenge as an interventions designer. Is at some point you have to stop. You have to do this thing and get it out there, and you have to stop fiddling with it. You have to say this is now the product, because it's also about creating a product. And I always want to make changes and go in certain directions. And I think as I was working on this, something similar happened. But yes, let's say it from the beginning, that part of what I want to do is to make the case that, you know, rather than spending I don't know, hundreds of thousands or millions of rands on developing, for instance, a new leadership intervention. consider that you can get going much faster, you can roll out much faster by using something like 9 conversations in leadership. And I'm not saying 9 conversations in leadership is the only thing. There may be other products from other companies. I want to make a specific case for what I understand as the approach to design. I think one of the challenges that organizations have is that old saying of Tolstoy. You know, he starts Anna Karenina with the words, all happy families are alike, but all unhappy families are unhappy in their own specific way. And I think all companies somehow have this idea that they are unhappy or ineffective or in need of innovation or special or etc. in their own specific way. And of course that's true. And that's something that we don't want to lose out of sight. But I do think that sometimes what we think is so special is not so special. What we think is so particular about us is actually quite generic and quite common. And that the particularity and the uniqueness of every organization lies in a different place. And therefore so yes, you can go out and design major unique intervention just for your organization, and that's cool. There's a proviso for that. You have to do proper and good design. It's not a matter of just slamming together some content and popping some trainers in front of people. It's an art, and beyond an art, it's also a craft. And I think there's some science, although I'm seldom interested in the science. But there's definitely art in it and specific skill that's required for designing interventions. So what I did is I changed. I'm going to share my screen with you. What I did is why doesn't it want to share? Okay, there we go. What I, of course, did immediately is I changed the title. Let's just get that. And I call it, and what I want to talk about is, because this the one part. The one part is we can create interventions that are scalable, that can be used in a variety of contexts. Of course, it's not always all contexts. There are some contexts for which certain interventions are more suitable and some less suitable. But so there's that question of can we use it anywhere, where can we use it, etc. And then there's also the question of interventions itself. How do we actually think about designing interventions? And that's where I went back to. And I want to talk about poetics of intervention. Now, poetics, I think one of the first people who used the word poetics is Aristotle. Aristotle wrote the Poetics of Aristotle, and of course it's related to the literary arts. And basically what it is a how-to manual. It says, you know, these are the different forms of poetry. You know, there's tragedy, and there's comedy, and there's history. And these are the sorts of styles that you should use, etc., etc. Of course, over the years, the notion of poetics has changed quite considerably, or deepened quite considerably. I think a poetics is kind of a way to say, this is how this particular thing works. So sometimes you get poets, I think most poets at some point would write a poem they call the Ars Poetica, the art of poetry, of writing poetry, in which in this poem they will express how they go about writing a poem and what's important in writing a poem, etc., etc. And I have to caution you because it's always half lie. It's never quite true what they are saying. So what I'm going to say about interventions is also to some extent not quite true. There's something else in there. And of course, this is always after the fact, because when you are designing an intervention, you just throw yourself into it and you do it. And you use your skills and your intuitions, and over time you learn certain things and so on. But at some point you can sit back and reflect and say, okay, if I wanted to teach this thing to someone, what would I teach them? Or if I wanted to convey what is this thing that I'm talking about, what would I convey? So a poetics of intervention is poetic. Poesis means to make. So it's really, how do we make interventions? How do we make them? That's the question that I pose to myself. And then, so there will be some theoretical things, some practical things that comes in. And then universal, particular, and original. If we talk about a scalable intervention, or let's say we have an intervention like 9 Conversations in Leadership. 9 Conversations in Leadership has been used in all the parts of the world. In Europe, I don't think it has been used in the Americas yet. We are there now. It's been used in Australasia, in Southeast Asia. It's all over Africa. It's been used. It's been used in the Middle East. It's even been used in Russia. So clearly it works in very different contexts. It's been used for parastatals, government organizations, big corporations, small entrepreneurial firms, etc., etc. So it's got quite a wide range, obviously. We can use it in a lot of contexts. So there's something, and I don't want to call it general. I'd rather refer to it as universal. And Thomas Hübel, he tells the story of, you know, when Moses went up the mountain to get the laws, and he came down, then God spoke to all the Israelites because they have been doing stuff they shouldn't have been doing. And there's a very particular line that says it felt to each person as if God spoke to them particularly. But it was the same message that was spoken. And I'm sure you've had this experience before in your life. You open a book and you read it and it feels like, wow, this has been just for me. It's speaking to me directly in this moment. Or you watch a movie, or many experiences like that. And for me, those are experiences where there is an aspect of the universal. It is universally true. It is universally applicable. It is not exclusive. So if I say it's universal, I'm not saying it is the only, but it is everywhere. And the interesting thing about the universal is that everyone experiences it as unique, as particular, as original in some sense. And I guess that's what an intervention needs to do at some level. It needs to speak something that is universal, that can be experienced by the individual or the group of individuals as this has been just for us. It has been made just for us. And that's the question. That's where we need to get. We need to get to the universal. Now, I think what often happens is that we confuse universal and general, and we try to create something that's generic. And if people say, no, I don't want an off-the-shelf product, they mean they don't want something that's just generic. Yes? Because who wants something that's generic? Nobody wants something that's generic. You know, there's something incredibly boring about the generic, and actually there's something very insulting about the generic. So we shouldn't give people generic stuff. The only generic stuff that's useful is medicine, because it's cheaper. But it works in the same way. So for me, that's key when we think about interventions and the scalability of interventions. Is this question of the universal and the particular, and I'll try to come back to it. And then, of course, there's the question of the original, because every company is unique. They think their problems are unique, and they want a solution or an intervention or a process or something. We can talk about what this thing intervention means. That is specific to them, that speaks to them only, that is original. They're the first ones in the market to be doing this. And I almost think it is, in a way, it is thinking about where originality is required in the wrong place. We don't need originality in process, we need originality in outcomes. You know, if a poet writes a sonnet, we all know what a sonnet is. A sonnet is 14 lines. There are a few forms of sonnets. Some are 4 lines, 4 lines, 4 lines, 2 lines. Some are 4 lines, 4 lines, 3 lines, 3 lines. But it's always 14 lines. No, there's nothing original about that. And yet, you'd hope that every single sonnet that's written is an original sonnet. It's got its own originality. It sort of transcends the form. And that, I think, is what we try to get right with scalable or packaged interventions. It is something that you use it, and in that moment that you use it, in that moment that it is in your organization, it allows your own originality and your creativity to come forward. And you can do something that is only so in your organization. It is nowhere else so. But you haven't had the need to create some fancy new consumable. I must honestly say that I think much of the insistence on originality in the wrong place is just sort of consumer frenzy. It is like, oh yeah, we've tried that thing. Let's try something else. And it's a bit silly. It's actually a bit self-indulgent. I'm very critical of that, as you can see. And I've got really nasty words about it. Good. So, interventions. What are interventions? And here I go back to the Worldview Academy model. I want us to distinguish between interventions and issues. An issue is the thing that the intervention tries to resolve. It's the why. Why do we do an intervention? In the first place, what do we mean by intervention? I think it's quite simple. It means we step in and we do something. I mean, we all know various kinds of interventions. Generally, the word intervention has got quite a negative connotation. It means something is really badly wrong and we need to intervene. We need to step in. We need to take steps. And we need to change something, we need to shift something. So someone has got a drug habit, we step in, we talk to them for a long time and we seclude them in some institution. And of course, when they come back, the problem is worse. So intervention is about an issue. And when it is about resolving something. And that's sometimes where I think a lot of confusion begins to take place. And in terms of scalability, that's also where the confusion starts to take place. The originality is your issue. But even in terms of your issue, there's some universality. So I want to ask you as a start for this question to just think for a moment about some interventions that you have experienced in your organizational context and what the intervention was and what the issue was that why did you do this intervention? What did you try to resolve? And I want to see if we can get, even at the issue level, to some level of, okay, there are some universal themes, there are some universal patterns that take place. Just before we start, the intervention can be something small. It can be you go and talk to someone, or intervention can be a long-term thing. So you implement a whole performance management system, and you do all the things that wrap around of the performance management system. That's also an intervention. The question is always, why do you do that? What is it that you are trying to do? What is it that you are trying to achieve with this intervention? Good. So how many people are we, Liesel? I can't see because of the screen share thing.
12.
12. Okay. So then I'm just going to ask you to think about it and to share. If anyone has ideas around interventions that you have. I just want to see if I can see more people. Where are the places where you generally use interventions? What are the kinds of interventions that are being deployed in your organization right now? And why are they being deployed? And if you are a facilitator or an OD consultant, what kind of interventions are you being asked to come and do in organizations?
Christo?
Yeah.
So a lot of the conversations we've been having has been around teams at the moment. And quite a lot of that is because they're now remote. So on the one side, there's how do I manage my team remotely? And on the other hand, there's how do we get the team to perform better, to understand each other? You know, how do we fix the team dynamics if they're not together in a room?
Yeah.
So those are some of the issues that I've heard. But what I thought about when you were talking about the interventions, I always love that a conversation with somebody is an intervention. Anything you do, a meeting can be an intervention. So something I've seen a few times in clients that I've loved is when there is a team issue, the team's not performing, and we suggest purposeful teams. And this comes from a conversation that I had with the Caterpillar International people, where they went, oh my goodness, I haven't even thought of that, is that piece that we have in purposeful teams at the beginning of day one, where somebody external and senior to the team must come and mandate the team. So somebody must come and tell the team, why do they exist? And that intervention in itself is so powerful often, because now you have to find who's this person. B, this person now has to present something. They have to prepare a why do you exist team presentation and a little talk around it, and then take questions. And that is sometimes the most difficult piece of the work. Yeah. Which then shows us that the issue is probably that this team isn't clear about their purpose because the person external and senior to them isn't clear about their purpose. So that's one of the interventions I love, that makes you go deeper and finding the issue.
Yeah.
And sometimes that is already problem now solved. Now you just have to give them a process to unpack this.
It's amazing, because for me, one of the first things that says is that point of interventions on interventions. I often think that actually if we just do that first work of figuring out what's the issue, almost nothing is needed anymore. Very little is needed anymore, or what we then do becomes very obvious. Because sometimes it seems that we are just doing stuff because somehow we have to do stuff, you know, we have to do a team intervention. Or we have to do some performance management training, or we have to, God forbid, to do some leadership development. You know, and we want to do leadership development, so I'm not being flippant about it.
Menno's raised her hand.
Just based on Liesel's point, yes, the interventions you implement holistically, but just having the teams speak in front of the leader sometimes is an intervention in themselves. The leader's so busy trying to be putting out fires and be important that he forgets to actually, or she forgets to actually speak to the team. And getting that feedback, that insight during an intervention is quite the phenomenal intervention on its own. You see the shift.
Yeah. It almost leads me to think that, for me, one of the more universal things that emerge, that is almost at the heart of every single intervention we do, is that at the start of the intervention, and why the intervention is necessary, is because people don't talk to each other. And people don't listen to each other, and then they don't know why they exist. They don't know what's expected of them, etc., etc. It's not. Some of these things can be resolved in very, very simple ways. But at the same time, you know, if you say people don't speak to each other, of course, then it starts to become a cultural issue sometimes, or a deep organizational habit around we don't speak to each other, or people don't give feedback, or the leaders are distant, or all sorts of things. Yes, Myrna?
Christo, it's not normally that because when you ask them, of course, I speak to my team all the time. But what they don't do is that leadership element where they structure conversations in a meaningful way for an outcome. They're not aware of the power they have as leaders to lead. So as much as you're doing an intervention by creating strategy, you're also teaching the leader that he needs to have structured conversations that lead to an outcome, and not somebody in the hall. You know, you meet someone in the hallway and say, hey, or you have a one-on-one for 15 minutes. That's not, that doesn't lead to change. That doesn't make people feel at ease. But actually understanding the context in detail and then structuring your conversations. So you do a leadership intervention while you're doing your intervention as well.
That's an interesting point, because it's not just conversation, it is to some extent purposeful conversation. And it is also certain kinds of conversations that people can learn to have. And what I also hear there is it is a way for the people in that group or collective or the leaders themselves to just shape their attention. I wonder to what extent sometimes, you know, if we say we bring in an intervention into a space, the work that the intervention does is to shape attention and to shape focus. It is to bring awareness to certain things as a first task, and to bring certain things onto the agenda of a group, for instance, that would help them to resolve the issues. And the issues may be what? You know, the team is not performing, the team is not connecting, the team is losing heart, all sorts of things. So if I can quickly talk to you about that, we call it the World Sphere Academy ontology of organization development, and you will see it's issue-centric. So if we design an intervention, there would be an issue. Purposeful teams has got an issue. And the issue is high-performing teams, high-performing purposeful teams. We wouldn't go and do purposeful teams for any other reason than to help a team to become a better team. Now, you see, already I'm slipping into all sorts of vague language, become a better team, high-performing, etc., etc., etc. But if I go to a general team, it says high-performing, you want to be high-performing, you want to be high-performing. They want to be high-performing, you want to perform better, there's space for improvement. Or it may be a team that's struggling. It's not getting together and it's not getting results. And so on. So the intervention is to help them to do that. That's the issue. Then, of course, there's a whole bunch of stuff around the issue. But the issue is at the center. And I guess that is really where the organizational conversation must be, is what's the issue? Then we figure out whose issue is it, what's the unique context, how do we make sense in the organization, and then finally, what is the specific kind of intervention that we are going to do. But in our thinking, this whole thing is already an intervention. There's a broader, we call it a big I intervention, is the moment you as a consultant or as an early practitioner is talking to the organization, that is already intervention itself, even if they're just asking you to give them a quote. Because then you have to say to them, okay, but a quote for what? And what do you want to achieve? And all sorts of that stuff. And then that becomes intervention type of questions. Then you go to specific tools and techniques and things. And I think when people want to often innovate in terms of interventions and want something unique, that's where they focus. They focus on that enablers piece. Is we're going to do something unique to shift this unique context. But maybe that's not where the focus should be. The focus should be is, do we really understand the issue well enough? Are we confusing issues and interventions with each other? Are we doing interventions on interventions? For me, an example of doing an intervention on an intervention would, for instance, be to say we have to fix the performance management system. Or we're going to do performance management training, or we're going to do something around the performance management. But performance management itself is an intervention. So it becomes an intervention on an intervention. And then, of course, there's the question of original and universal issues. And I think mostly we can say that in the field of organization development, some issues emerge as fairly universal issues, issues around leadership, development, issues about, let's say, organizational transformation, organizations that go through crisis, and so on. There are more universal issues in those spaces. Good, so I want to go to the next slide. Something that I left out here is there's a small little piece there that says the code. And what are the beliefs and values that guide the early practitioner? And I think that's also important. It's something that we need to take into account when we think about the designing of interventions. And for me, that comes down to a question of the ethics of intervention. And you know, as designers of interventions, we can't sidestep this question. What is the ethics of the intervention? And what is at the heart of this question of the ethics of intervention? For me, what is emerging really as very important is I think something around the dominant paradigm in many organizations. And that's where you see right at the bottom, I have propaganda, instrumentalism, buy-in versus insight, etc. Is sometimes organizations will call you in to develop an intervention, and it's just to get everyone in line. And get everyone on board and get buy-in from everyone, or the intervention would be propaganda, etc. And so from the perspective of the designer, there's probably, and for me there certainly is, there's a very specific approach or view or stance, I would call it rather a stance, towards how I see an intervention work in an organization and what it does. Is it supporting the hegemony of the powers that be in the organization? Is it supporting the patriarchal or paternalistic contract in the organization? So is it keeping everyone kind of dependent and disempowered? Or do we, with intervention, go in there and there's a very specific approach that says that, well, we are working with human beings here. It's not just instrumental. And then inside, built into the process of the intervention will be, you know, do we work with the democratization of, for instance, leadership, as 9 Conversations in Leadership does? Do we work with the assumption that people need to make their own sense and come to their own conclusions about things, or are we just trying to sell stuff to them? And so on. I don't know if there are any particular, I mean when you go through interventions in organizations and deal with them, what kind of ethical questions arise for you?
Christo?
Yeah.
Ashira has made an interesting comment there. Ashira, I don't know if you're willing to tell us about it, because I think there's some ethical considerations in that issue or in that context.
Hi, Liesl. Yeah, sure. Just that, you know, it's a difficult place to be in at the moment. The company is going through a lot of change. And I think it just highlights the pressure in an OD function to almost put something in place that's going to magically improve the situation. And, you know, we're going through these retrenchments. It's a difficult time. People are losing their jobs. There's a lot of emotion. There's a lot of pressure for teams that are now smaller to deliver. And, you know, within the next couple of weeks, we are having to, of course, give a space for employees to really just manage the changes that they're going through. I think personally, but also professionally, how are they going to, I think what's important is for them to actually make sense of what's happening and why it's happened. And there's been some communication around, you know, the case for change, but there's some personal feelings, I think, that need to be dealt with before we can even think about the future. So that's just where we find ourselves at the moment. And, you know, there isn't that silver bullet that will lead to success. I think it's going to be a process. And yeah, we're going to really have to give it some thought as the HR leadership team as to how this is going to unfold.
Yeah.
And you said something so true in your comment as well, is post this trauma. So, so we also need to think that there was a lot of trauma, and even the people who are left over need the safe space almost to deal with that and to go through that and to not ignore it.
Yeah.
Yeah. Maslow's hierarchy of needs comes to mind, where if you don't feel safe and you don't have those essential needs fulfilled, how are we ever going to think about growth and learning and what's next if we can't get past that?
Yeah. I guess for me that is where the challenge of instrumentalism in interventions come up. Is they often very singularly performance or outcomes focused. So you do the intervention so that smaller teams can still perform at a very high level, or even do more with less, etc., etc. And I just think this is quite common in organizations, that sort of sometimes the perspective with which an intervention is introduced in the organization is it's going to be this kind of fix. I've also seen it sometimes, Ashira. Sometimes you would be called in to coach somebody, because that person is a problem, and you have to somehow fix this person. You have to fix this person's mindset. You have to fix this person's behaviors, and you have to get this person to perform more effectively. And I guess the big challenge is, where is the intervention focused, and what does the intervention do? Years ago, I designed a values program for one of the telcos, and it was one of these, the moment you have trained the trainer for programs, it's basically scalable. But I have to ask myself today if I would design that program the same way and have the same thoughts about it. Because in a way it was, I have to think of it today as a certain kind of an indoctrination. And I have to ask myself, did I indoctrinate through this process? Was this process used as a form of organizational coercion? Or is it almost like a healing intervention in the organization? Is it something that can shift maladaptive processes and make maladaptive processes become more adaptive processes? Is it an intervention that actually considers the people who are participating in the intervention as human beings with human motivations, human peculiarities, human difficulties, human talents, human gifts, human resistances, all of their full humanity, and can they bring that full humanity to that space, and in that space discover the way that they want to go and could go forward. And then I think, for me, that would almost be the kinds of ethical questions that I ask. Is are we helping people, or are we creating space through the intervention for people to have insights, real insights, not sort of the propaganda insights? You can have insights as long as it's the things that I want you to see. Can we open up people's perspectives? Can we help people to come to terms with those things that you mentioned? They feel hurt, they feel frustrated, they also feel anxious. And why wouldn't they? I mean, who in this economy does not feel anxious? And around them, people have been retrenched, so they also probably feel sad, and they feel under immense pressure by the organization, by the whole system of the organization, to keep running and to keep to be a valuable factor of production. And what is it that the intervention does? Does the intervention create a space for them to, as human beings, figure out human ways to do things, or does it compel them into groupthink, compliance, obeisance to the prevailing cultural norms? So many cultural programs, I think, is actually deeply unethical, because basically what they tell people is FIFO, fit in or go away, which is terrifying. In a way, I think it's actually terrifying. I mean, who doesn't fit into an organization? Okay, some criminals maybe, but don't you want diversity, etc.? So So I often, and behavioral programs, you know, we are all going to implement these behaviors, these precise behaviors, and we're going to be measured. I think that's the risk of values programs, is that it creates a sort of a normative framework that actually becomes dogmatic and restrictive, and that tells many people that here in this workplace, you can't be who you really are. You have to pretend, you have to bring something else here, etc. So those are just ethical questions for me that are there, and I think it's difficult because this is enormous pressures organizations need to perform, you know, personally, I don't think they will perform if they compel people and force people treat people in an instrumentalistic way, treat people as disposable, and treat people as factors of production, and treat people as you know, in a sort of a strict behavioralist Pavlovian kind of a way. We're going to dangle some stuff before you, and we're going to have some punishments, and we're going to get you to do exactly what we want to do. Those are also interventions. So for me as an intervention designer, I can't get away from that. If I design leadership programs, there must be something in there about the release of the inherent potential in the leadership in that organization. And unfortunately, I think to some extent it can be rather unpredictable. It's not always so comfortable for the powers that be. We're sticking long here. I must move on, right? So who, where, what is a question for me in intervention design. And here I have sort of used Ken Wilber's all quadrants, all levels model, but only the quadrants, all quadrants. One of the big things that we work with interventions is we work with the individual and the collective. So sometimes, obviously, we intervene with individuals, we coach individuals. I am always deeply skeptical if we only coach the individual, for instance, or work with the individual and do not work with the collective at the same time, because of, Judith Butler calls it sociality, because this idea that individuals don't really exist if they are not part of some kind of collective. We don't exist except in the relationship. I think that is very strongly held in the idea of Ubuntu as well. So for instance, we may coach some individual to fix them, but nothing happens in the collective level. And it's actually in the collective where this relationship plays out. So that's one of the factors in intervention design is, are we working with individual or are we working with collectives? And if we work on the collective level, we worked with what is shared, so shared perspectives, shared commitments, all of those kinds of things that we are looking for as outcomes. If we work with individuals, sometimes, you know, you have top leadership and you will send them to the university and they will go on a university leadership program where they will learn, yes, fairly generic stuff, not universal stuff, and come back into the collective, into the context of the organization. It's a little bit of a gestalt idea that is very important there. We are always part of something and we only understand ourselves as part of something. So for instance, if we have a team intervention, there would be the team as group, the team as a collective, but also each individual member inside the team. We need to work with both those aspects and the aspects in which it interrelates. If we work with a team, we also need to work with the team inside the larger collective of the organization, which is why questions of mandate, questions of stakeholder relationships, etc., are so important. And then the other axis that is there that I think should inform us very strongly when we are working with the design of interventions is the question of Ken Wilber speaks of exterior and interior. Ken Wilber actually speaks of objective and subjective, which is terms that I try to avoid. The exterior, observable, actual world, what we would call the real world or the material world. And then the interior world, which is the world of our thoughts and our dreams and our motivations and all sorts of things that we can't even see, conscious and unconscious. And if we look at the things in the exterior world would provide structure, or it would represent the structure in which we act. And the interior world, I think, is the world where we can locate what we would call agency. If we say that agency is something like the willingness or the ability to make decisions, to make choices, to act. It's that source of movement. Of course, it's constrained by the exterior world. Now, when we work with an intervention, we have to focus on all of those levels. We have to focus on what is exterior, the system in which, so for instance, if you do leadership development, it does not help to just talk about what's happening inside. It does not help to just explore the aspects of the individual personality, for instance. You know, to unpack everyone's Enneagram type, for instance. That's good stuff. It's important stuff. We must do it, but it's not enough. We have to also see and explore how does this manifest in the external world, and what is the relationship between the internal world and the external world, and how is the internal world constrained by the external world, and how is what is actually possible in the external world constrained by you know, things like limiting beliefs or maladaptive worldviews or all those sorts of things that happen in organizations. Any questions about that? I think if we, Craig often mentions the question of, Deming said 95% of all organizational or individual behavioral problems are caused by the system. They're not caused by the individual. So if we don't work on the system, but my question always is, who works on the system? You know, and for that you need agency. So you can't de-link these things. If you work with leadership, leadership has got this responsibility to see that they are responsible for the system and they have to do the work on the system. And that requires agency and interiority. Good. Any questions about that? So now I want to talk to you about the contexts and universality in the design of interventions. And the first, well, let's start with Karl Marx, who said, we make history and conditions not of our own making. So often we can go with an intervention and we can try to shift things in the individual, or we may even try to shift things in the world. But we need to take into account that the team and the individual are always already within what we would call a world. And that's a picture of Heidegger, because Heidegger is the guy who has got the most to say about the world. The world is this significant whole in which we find ourselves always already. So if I am an individual and I'm part of the team, and we can speak of the world of the team, then I make sense of everything related to the team in terms of this team world. The team world gives me a language. the way in which we speak to each other. It gives me the rules of engagement. It gives me the context of what we want to do, what we don't want to do. Heidegger says it gives us things the way they are. And it is always, we always find ourselves in the world. So that's the first thing that we need to take into an account when we think about interventions and when we think about the scalability or the transposability of interventions. For instance, we can distinguish between the corporate world and government world. We can distinguish between the Western world and other worlds, the Eastern world or the African world, with things that are appropriate and a matter of fact and completely assumed in the Western world and in Western approaches be the right thing in other worlds. Would it make sense in other worlds? So what is the universal that we are looking for in terms of world? For what world? And we can turn this around. We can say, for what world are we creating the intervention? Are we designing the intervention? The world of this organization, the world of this industry, the world of corporations and this economy, this global, the world of capitalism, the Western world of achievement and rationality, etc., etc. That's one of the first things, and that's one of the first things I think we implicitly, intuitively understand it, but it's useful for us to take a step back and to ask ourselves, also from an ethical perspective, is this what we want? Is this where we are going? Are we taking everything in this world into account? And these three models that I gave you are just three things. There may be many more things in which we can understand context and conditions. The second one there in the middle is the Cynefin model. For those who don't recognize that funny squiggle, I just put it in. The Cynefin model, basically, or Cynefin landscape, or Cynefin framework, I don't think Dave Snowden would like it when I call it a model, says that there are different worlds of complexity. So this is the world, what's the relative, or what's the complexity of this world? Some worlds are ordered, we understand cause and effect, and some worlds are less ordered. We don't really understand cause and effect. Now you can imagine, if we design an intervention in a world in which we understand cause and effect pretty well, it would be a different kind of an intervention from an intervention in a world where we actually don't know what causes what. At the same time, we may understand certain things that cause certain things, certain causal relationships, but other causal relationships we don't understand. So that brings to intervention design itself a degree of complexity. I think it's helpful for us to reflect when we do interventions and when we design interventions, at what level of complexity do they operate? I think a scalable intervention has got its own specific challenges. It needs to be open in some way, so it needs to be completely allowing a certain kind of emergence, which means that it's unpredictable. The relationship between cause and effect is not always there, while at the same time providing a certain predictable kind of process. And then the third model that I have there is the Euphoria expanded identity framework or model. And it says that in organizations, in cultures, we may get a certain kind of a center of gravity as far as the maturity of the people in the organization is concerned. Now imagine you want to implement or you want to transform the organization to become more agile. But most of the people in your organization are at the lower levels of maturity, which means that they can't conceptually deal with the challenges that real agility would pose. then the intervention has got a very specific task of integration, I would say, on the one hand, and of releasing, getting people to become less defended. Getting people to loosen up their identities, to be less attached in their identity formation to certain things. For instance, if you want to go agile and you are really, really, really attached to what you know, to your level in the organization, to your specific idea of leadership, let's say your leadership idea is some Ken Blanchard stuff that you learned about, situational leadership, and that's your framework, and so on and so on and so on. It's going to be hard for you to actually move into the complexity that in the first place made the organization think that, hey, we should become more agile because things are uncertain, they're changing all the time, and the role of the leader is actually not that precisely, clearly defined any longer. So that is that is some of the things that I think we take into account contextually. For me, these three frameworks would be very helpful because I think they do express something that is beyond organization. We can design for a certain kind of a world. Let's say the organizational world as we know it and as it is transforming. And we understand some stuff about what is happening in the world. What are the kinds of transformations the world goes through. We understand something about the relative complexities inside organizations. And then we can also design very specifically for transformations that happen on the expansion of identity. I wonder if anyone has any questions about this or any comments to make about this. Would you design the same kind of intervention for people who have a very strong bounded identity that says we are we and they are they, and we like strict authority and so on, as you would design for a team of designers who are all very open, very flunky in some respects. They'd like to do very open things. And they mostly working in complex, in spaces where there's not a clear link between outcomes and between causes and effects.
Christo.
Yeah, Roy.
I wonder, your question speaks to the, having the same intervention for people at different levels of maturity or vertical integration development, or people that, if you think about Electrod's work around complexity, people that generate different levels of complexity. I was reflecting on this actually in a conversation with Brad a week or so back. And would you give a pre-packaged, this is the process, stick with the process, to an exco versus middle management? And my thoughts were, it's if you're giving a pre-packaged intervention to an exco of an enterprise, really large business, it's like giving them crayons to draw architectural mock-ups. The process holds value to a point, but the nuance and complexity may be lost. And that was something that I was thinking about, and I think it brings light onto the topic of are prepackaged interventions applicable in all contexts?
Yeah, I think that's a very important question, Roy, because I think if we design prepackaged, we implicitly target a certain band, and I would prefer to target the band on the maturity model, but I also think a band that can be targeted. You know, the Elliott-Jaques model is also, because it's so often used in organizations, it does bring a specific focus. So I don't think you would necessarily, and so it depends on the abstraction of the program and the openness of the program. And your intervention can be so open that it's almost too open, and it can be so bounded that it's really applicable to only one level. If you think of our new manager program, new manager bootcamp, it's pretty bounded. It's aimed at, and say in Elliott-Jaques terms, it's aimed at Elliott-Jaques level two, managing others. Also in the leadership pipeline, it's targeted at managing others. And it's clear about that. And it's clear that the kind of complexity in which those people tend to work would be around here in the complicated domain, mostly. Is you manage processes and so on and so on. Although people need to be made aware of some of the real complexity that is always there when you have to relate to other human beings and you have to manage other human beings. That's what I hate about the Elliott-Jaques model, is I don't think it's conscious enough about that stuff. And then you would assume that new managers, mostly, depending on the industry and the organization, would sit there in group defended or knowledge defended. So there's a certain maturity aspect that we have to be conscious of. So if people are group defended or conforming, and they are managers, the key thing that the intervention needs to help them to do, and now this becomes scalable across organizations, across industries, they need to start differentiating themselves from their peers. That's important for a manager. I think it's one of the most difficult things a new manager has to do, is that differentiation from your peers. And step up and stick out the neck, you know, and deal with the tall poppy fears. If they are knowledge defended, then they need to start to integrate that and to see that their way of seeing things is important, it's valuable, but it's not the only way. You have to start to include other people's views into. So you can, in a single intervention like that, I think you can probably work across two levels. Something like 9 conversations in leadership, I think, because it's more open, would actually, the level at which it would be much more open. You could bring the 9 conversations into an organization where there's a really high level of maturity, and lot will depend on the facilitation, though. If you have a facilitator in that space who is knowledge defended or outcomes defended, who just wants to achieve the outcomes and follow the process to the detail, then you're going to have a problem. But the process itself contains the right questions, some of the right information, and it contains the right flow to help people. So yeah, it depends. When I was rethinking 9 conversations in leadership to develop a version 4, for me, that was a big question, was at what level is it pitched? At what level is it pitched? And then with what sort of leeway to either side? What does it allow? I think if you work with an Xcode team that's all of them are post-conventional in terms of maturity, then you shouldn't bother with packaged interventions. You should actually not even bother with designing the interventions. You should just walk in there and facilitate. I don't even think you need to prepare that much.
So I suppose just understanding the context and where the people are.
Yeah. Well, really, if you are a facilitator at the post-conventional level, if you're working with a team of the best thing you can do as a facilitator is to really work on yourself to get out of the way. And
less than 20% of the population is at that level of maturity.
Yeah.
The chances of finding an Xcode that's fully at that level.
Yeah, it's generally what you're going to have to work with is an Xcode where maybe one or two of the Xcode is there and the rest sit at specializing or achieving them. So there's real conflict and you have to deal with that conflict. Now, that is something that we can design into the interventions in terms of, for instance, if we design into a scalable intervention, the understanding of the different levels of maturity. And we design into the intervention specific processes around understanding where does conflict emerge, how does it emerge, and how do we resolve those conflicts. It means that we do not give content for those challenges, but we think at a process level about them. Does that answer your question, Roy? Does it raise any questions for anyone else?
Yeah, it does answer my question, and it was just thoughts to your question. So I wouldn't design the same intervention for different levels of organization. And
Yes.
just think about working on an Xcode. How much money does a conflict cost in lost man hours?
Yes.
And to solve that, to bring the Xcode together would be hugely valuable.
So in terms of scalability, that's one of the questions we've been grappling at WorldSphere Academy is can you design a process that is universal enough that can be used for many executive teams? Because executive teams tend to be at a higher level, they tend to have their specific questions, etc. And for me, once again, it comes down to at what level of abstraction do you work and where do you abstract? If you're going to work at the level of content, if content becomes your thing according to which you frame, then you can't. But if you think of patterns and archetypes, etc., then you can actually design something that is open enough. There's always a proviso there, and that is the facilitator and the ability of the facilitator to handle complexity. So as you increase complexity, the facilitator obviously needs to be able to handle much more complexity. See, I always think I have too few slides, and when I start working, I realize that I have way too many slides. I'm not going to spend a lot of time here about the establishment and adaptation landscape, but it is a really important part of our design methodology and of what makes the process scalable. The establishment and adaptation landscape basically says that the organization is a field or a landscape, comes into existence or a landscape, or if you would use the Heidegger idea, you would say it's a work that sets up a world. So there's an organizational world, right? And that organizational world, what happens in that organizational world? Well, how does that organizational world come into existence? And Craig's work on that is two things. The one is establishment and the one is adaptation. Establishment is the structure of the organization. It is the abstract aspect of the organization. It is the rules of the organization, the laws of the organization, the coded part of the organization. You know, let's take a team and we say, what is the structure of the team? Well, the team has got a purpose, and the team has got a specific capability, and the team has got, there's a team system, and there are roles and behaviors in the team, and the team also has got a meeting pattern, a meeting cycle. That's the structure of the team. This structure is completely abstract until we act into it. It only becomes real when people show up into the structure. When people show up into the structure, how they show up is constrained by the structure. So if the team's purpose is to do something and not something else, then I'm constrained in how I show up. I need to show up for something and not something else. And at the same time, the way I show up is changing the structure. It is adapting the structure. So there's this recurrence between establishment and adaptation. And that is really important to understand, because this is fundamentally what the intervention does. Ask ourselves, what does the intervention do? It is an establishment and adaptation process and then you can go into all sorts of details. It's an establishment and adaptation landscape that form, and there are different places on this landscape. And if you want to really think about intervention that is scalable for a high degree of complexity, this is a very useful model, because you can ask yourself, where on this landscape is the pain points or the shifts that is required for this specific team, and you can have processes and tools and techniques and frameworks and things linked to that. And it becomes very dynamic. And your dynamic facilitator, well versed in the methodology, could then facilitate something which is a product or an intervention, but that could be, every single experience of it would be vastly different. And it then has this predictable effect of moving towards increased integration. So some of the aspects there, you know, we are always already inside a landscape or a world. We are, this is, to be alive means to live in a world that preceded one's own arrival and that will survive one's own departure. And often this is the case with organizational contexts as well, as we join it and we exit it. And it is for you as the person with the intervention in any case, there's the organization. When the intervention is over, the organization will be there still. So important things that happen in that establishment and adaptation process is inclusion and exclusion. What's inside the landscape and what's not in the landscape. What's inside the organization, not. What's inside the team and not. Both in terms of issues and in terms of who belongs there. It is an unfolding and a becoming, so it's never a static thing. It's not a thing. The process is integration, and what happens in organizations, teams, and individuals is there is either a contraction or an expansion taking place. A contraction means that the world becomes smaller and agency becomes smaller. You know, the agency, the capacity to adapt. World, the establishment, the context. If a team goes through a severe crisis or trauma, for instance, their world would typically contract. They would feel there's less possibility. And at the same time, what would probably also happen is people would become more scared to act. They would become more cautious, more risk averse, things like that. And that probably could lead to all sorts of challenges for this team. They start to think small and they become small. And I think the work of the intervention, whether you are working with the leadership group, with the leadership of an organization, with a team, with individuals, is to participate in that expansion process. These people's world needs to become bigger, and their sense of who they can be and how they can act in that world needs to become bigger. And I set that out almost as a challenge for interventions. I would say if an intervention does not make people's world bigger and their sense of themselves bigger, it's not worth doing. So now I've got a whole piece of theory here about how interventions work. An intervention, if we say the organization is a work, it's a work like a work of art. There it sits, the beautiful Kandinsky piece of art. But let's imagine that's an organization, it's a work. A work sets up a certain kind of a world. So this work makes you look at the world in a certain way. It gives you a language for the world, it gives you a way to think about the world, it gives you aspirations, all sorts of things. That's the world of the organization, the work of the organization. They really go together. When we do an intervention, we want to shift or transform something about the work and about the world that it sets up. So sometimes when we think about an intervention, we think about an intervention as something coming from the outside. It's something that we do from the outside. But I want to suggest that we think of intervention as something that is taking place, that is coming from the inside of the organization, acts from the inside in the organization, is part of the flow and the transformation of the organization, can affect the organization only through a kind of a hermeneutical understanding. And with hermeneutical understanding, we mean that in order to understand something better, you already have to understand it to some extent. It is that understand. So if I want to understand the possibility of an organization and how it could be different, I can only start with what is already inside the organization. And in that sense, I think scalable intervention works well if it works in this hermeneutical fashion. In other words, it does not come with all sorts of ideas and processes and frameworks from the outside and impose them onto the organization. Because that would not be hermeneutical. That would be like, here's best practice for you guys. You've got to follow best practice now, good practice. Or we've got a policy or a strategy blueprint for you. You guys must just implement it. That's not the, we've got a competency framework for you. Got a leadership competency framework for you. It's best practice. All the top organizations in the world are doing this competency framework. You guys must just implement it. And you will be 100%. And we don't believe that could work. That would be generic as an intervention. If we want to have a universal intervention that provides a particular experience for the organization, it needs to work in this kind of a hermeneutical way. So in some ways we can say inside the organization there's the actual lived culture. That is the understanding that people have of their world, and at the same time, which is also part of their world in the organization, is what we want to be and who we say we want to be. As an organization, those two things live at the same time, and they live in tension with each other, but they also live in wholeness with each other. I think sometimes in an organization, there would be a big split between these things, between the actual culture and the espoused culture. And that's sometimes the challenge with values, is you have values on the wall and the actual values that people are living, and there's a big disconnect between them. So part of your intervention process would be to reduce this disconnect, but not to take it away, the tension between them, to work with this tension between who we are, who we have been, who we are, and who we are becoming. And that, of course, is an iterative process and happens only inside the organization. And an intervention, therefore, would work inside with the organization, with what is already inside the organization, with the understandings that are inside the organization. And I'll show you just now in more detail. But I see it as different various interventions that they are inside, they happen inside the context of the organization. It's not like we take the team, we may even take the team away for 2 days to the bush, where they braai and kayak and drink in the evening and do really hard thinking in the morning and figure out stuff in the afternoon, etc. It's a beautiful intervention. It's slightly different from the normal work, but it would be wrong to see this as not their work, as something outside of their work, because then you get this tension between, oh, this is not our real work, this is just something we do, it has no impact on what we actually do. You know, we go on these interventions and we do all of these things and nothing ever changes, etc., etc. That won't happen when we work with the content and when the organization itself generates the content of the intervention. Intervention just provides the framework, space, the holding for this to happen. A good intervention at the right level of abstraction or universality. So just in terms of what it may look like, if I take everyone, typically I think an intervention may consist of several processes. So 9 conversations, you would see 9 of these things happen for each team or each cohort that goes through. For purposeful teams, it may be 1 with 1 follow-up. And you can see it becomes really like almost like little cellular modular components that you can figure out how they need to fit into this big context of the organization. What it looks like, I think, is the intervention, what we call the intervention in the end, or the intervention process, exists within the organization. People bring into that space, they bring their experience and their awareness and their presence to participate in the intervention process. What feeds into the intervention process is the actual life world in the organization, the lived culture, where people are right now. It does not help if we meet them here, just where they want to be and what kind of organization. That also feeds in. And in that tension between who we are becoming and who we have been becoming, and the sense making of all of what happens there, we can have a shift. And that shift is in every single, so if you, for instance, go through 9 conversations in leadership, you would have a shift after the sponsor conversation, because it would follow this basic process. It would take into account of it. There would be world making and integration, and the potential shift, however micro, will take place. Then you start to take the cohorts through. After conversation 1, there would be a shift. How do we define the shift? I think it's sometimes hard, but what we are doing, as you can see, is we are enabling people to shift their world. They shift in Aristotle's words, they shift the agent-arena relationship. The agent-arena relationship is expanded. Think of yourself as a bullfighter, and you are in the arena. And there you are inside the arena, your whole world, everything, you make sense of everything inside this arena. That's the arena, is the context, the world. And you are an agent. Only inside this arena are you an agent. And And it's up to you to use your agency. And your agency can make this arena a beautiful, expanded place of possibility, or it can make it a place of fear and dread. And I guess that's some of the kinds of shifts that takes place through then the right sense-making frameworks and practice inside the, I would call it the intervention encounter. We use conversation a lot, and you will see they also think of it as conversion, as turn, as change that takes place. The intervention event is creates a kind of a liminal space. So it's inside the organization, yet it's outside of normal organizational time. It's almost like it's an in-between space. And that's what intervention also means. It means step in between. It creates this in between the normal, but not entirely. It's not outside it. It's another kind of a dimension of it. Yeah, questions about that? This really for me is the methodology of scalable programs. And that's why they work. They work because they work at the right level of abstraction. We don't bring in stuff from the outside, we work from the inside. The frameworks, you know, if you use Cynefin, or you use a strategy framework, or you use whatever, you use some framework for team dynamics, like the Lencioni 5 dysfunction stuff, you can bring in any of that stuff. There's millions of that stuff. There's so much. Nobody ever has to come up with anything again. You can just repurpose that. But that's not the stuff that matters. The stuff that the design that matters is around how do you fit this thing inside the organization that it can draw from the organization and feed back into the organization. And that's what makes the scalable or the packaged product also unique, because for what the conversation for one team will never be even remotely the same as the conversation for the other team, but it will still have the same universal theme. Sure, I see time is running. Quickly, now you ask, okay, in terms of universal or scalable and unique, for me, this is part of the thinking that sits behind that, that we move between abstraction and concreteness. That if we want something that is so particular to this organization, we're probably looking for something specific and concrete. And we may become overly focused on content. If we shift and we want to design something that is useful across many industries, across many types of organization, in many different kinds of worlds, we have to move up towards a certain level of abstraction, and or for me, not necessarily abstraction, but patterns, certain patterns that become more universal, that are universally recognized. And we start to focus more on form than on content. And some of the deepest patterns that we can find are the archetypal patterns. And generally, I think one of the quickest ways to go to the universal and the particular in intervention design is to go to the archetypal patterns. I'm just going to quickly show you those three, and then I'm going to stop. Archetypes of crisis or kairos, which means turning point, crisis, turning point, transformation. All of those things are the same. And that's generally why we are intervening in organizations. There's a story structure, the use of narrative. And there are three things that I like to use. The one is theory U, because it gives a certain kind of a journey process, which is fairly universal. If you follow that, You connect to something that people understand, even if they don't understand it. People do these kinds of things in their normal lives. And if they reflect on their normal lives, this is the kind of structures that people tend to use, even if they don't know they're using it. So it makes the finding of the universal much more, much you will see I've got the Enneagram symbol in there. The Enneagram symbol, we use it in two ways. The one way we use it is very consistent as a pattern, is when we design an intervention, we make sure that we connect on 3 levels and develop on 3 levels: the gut level, or the hands level, or the level of action, the level of heart and relationship, and the level of mind or perspectives. And then I've recently, with Ingrid Hurwitz, designed, I'm still busy in designing a program for youth leaders for our Greek partners, where we use the Enneagram cycle as a cycle of transformation. So you start with Enneagram 9, connection to the world, and then Enneagram 1, order, 2, relationship, Enneagram 3, achievement, Enneagram 4, develop your creativity, Enneagram 5, how do you think, 6, how do you become more real, 7, vision and partnership, and 8, action, go out and act, do it. That becomes a very strong archetypal pattern if you follow it consistently as a story structure. And then, of course, the hero's journey. So there are many of these basic archetypal structures that you use to organize at a high enough level so that people can now into that bring their own content. Of course, you also bring content into that. If you work in a specific client, you know, bring into it your leadership code, and you bring into it your idea of what the organizational values should be. And you bring into, let's say, one of these conversations, you talk about what do we mean by competence and what are the competencies. And there's place for it. And it can be specific to the organization, but the structure is consistent. And in that consistency, in that archetypal consistency, I think lies the power of all interventions, and lies the possibility of creating interventions that could be used across a very wide variety of contexts. And there I want to stop for now. And here there are questions and thoughts.
I don't know if it's a question or a comment or a thought. Nee?
Yes.
But so a little while ago, I heard you say that the conversations are not the same, but the conversations are, you know, and there's what comes from outside, but what happens inside and so on. And then even with these theories or models or frameworks or whatever that you bring in, I still think the magic lies in the process facilitation.
Yeah.
The process. So using everything that you talked about today to then put it into a process that can be scaled.
Yeah.
And to really trust that process, to really be that the OD code of guide on the side, not sage on the stage. I'm not here to teach you anything. Wisdom is in the room. I'm bringing processes to get that. And that all of this stuff is almost the secret sauce in the background.
Yes, this is.
You don't go in and teach your team about the U theory, but you're going to use the U theory.
This sits in the back.
Yeah.
Yes. All of this stuff sits in the back. Yeah. And I mean, we can design processes in many ways. We can have highly instrumental, we can have scientific, we can have process diagrams type of stuff, and then we can move into more archetypal types and process design. And then, of course, you have micro process inside. So inside each conversation, you would have a beginning, a middle, and an end. You know, you have to start the conversation. How do you start? Everyone say hello and who they are. And then you explore something. Maybe you have some conflict, and maybe you have to work out some uncertainties, and then you conclude it. And that's process. That becomes archetypal. For me, that is the archetypal nature of how we pass through time in space. We start somewhere, and we find ourselves somewhere and connect, and we make this little space in which we are going to do something, and then we disband it and we go on. And you're so right. Inside that is the magic of process. And there is so much around process. You know, specific process tools like deliberating structures and conversational methodologies and simulation exercises and all sorts of things that are always aimed at one thing only, I think, and it is to get people to engage around whatever it is that they are resolving.
You said right in the beginning, you said shape, attention, and focus.
Yeah.
And bringing issues to the agenda.
Yeah.
And then the other thing that I was thinking is, you have at the bottom of this slide a beginning, a middle, and an end. Is that trust?
Someone said that.
Yeah, well, but trusting that process, that yes, there will be a muddle.
Yeah.
There's usually, if with hard work like this, at the bottom of the U and at the abyss of the hero's journey and whatever,
Yes.
this bloody uncomfortable, awful piece.
Yes.
That you also, as the OD practitioner and facilitator, you have to allow the people that you're holding in the safe space to have that very uncomfortable happening thing with them, without, as a facilitator, feeling, oh my goodness, this is going way wrong, I must fix it immediately. You have to then trust that process and have a strong process to help them to get through that, to then get to return, transformation and return and whatever.
Yeah. It's almost as if you are moving through a landscape, and at some point there are certain places that you will reach, or that you could reach. And if you have a fairly simple process, there's one route, and there's certain stops along this route. If you have a complex process, maybe you move through a landscape where you don't quite know the journey, but you know by tonight you need to get sort of there. And then you can sleep, and it's safe there, and people will feed you and stuff like that. And I think that the thing with the designed process, like 9 conversations or purposeful teams or any of the other designed interventions, is that it gives the facilitator, for wherever you are on the landscape, just what is needed at that point to have the right conversation. But it does not absolve the facilitator or the participants from the responsibility to participate and make sure that what happens there happens, and yes, to trust the process. I trust.
Also, what I was just thinking now, if a process like maybe purposeful teams is designed to take you through that to watch out to not suddenly go, yeah, sure, we can do it in 4 half days.
Yeah.
Because you might then break it up where it shouldn't be broken to continue next week.
It's an interesting thing that you mentioned, because if I were to design a 2-day process versus 4 half-day processes, the design approach would be very different, because a 2-day process has got a night. A night is part of your design, even if you do nothing in that night. It's part of what happens. It's part of where some of the processing takes place, and you design for it. Something that you do on the second morning, that's very specific to the second morning. That's very different from the first morning. So those things are, I guess, Liesl, for me, it's another point in terms of scalable, productized processes. There's the question of the facilitator, there's the question of governance, there's the question, I mean, for Worldsphere Academy, for us, that's a really important question, is you know, often when you go into organizations, what you do is you do facilitator accreditation, but it's for people who have been trainers their whole lives, and the training ethos is a very different ethos from facilitation of this kind of process. Training it's the same thing always. It's general, and if it's a product, it's just general. It's not universal. As a facilitator, you need someone with the capacity who can enter into what is universal and enable that to flow, and mostly to listen and to step aside and to just hold space and hold process. And that's one of the big requirements. I think, you know, instead of organizations investing lots of money into the design of new processes, I think organizations should invest a lot of money into developing a really deep facilitator capability. It would make the world of difference in organizations. It's much more important to have really good facilitators in an organization, in your OD or your HR department, than it is to have a new shiny bells and whistle leadership development program.
Can I chip in here? Throughout your wonderful talk, Christo, I've been thinking about something we spoke about almost near the beginning of this lockdown period, is how OD work and it fits into this context is often covert. Clients think they know what they need, but they don't, and the trick is to guide it in that direction. And if I had to think of a newly designed process or a specifically designed process for a client, or a steady sort of intervention that's been tried and tested, is that a newly designed process almost brings in the client, so that I think clients that sometimes want to try and control what the outcome is, as opposed to just allowing the process to happen. And that has an impact on where it goes, because it's almost like they want to almost control in some way where the process is going. The magic often happens not in the direction you thought it would, I think.
Yeah, it's an interesting question for me, Richard, because I mean, I think the client knows what the client wants to some extent, always. But part of our work is to just lead it deeper towards, because what is wanted is often at a fairly superficial level, or more or less superficial level. More or less deep. Let me put it in a positive way. It's more or less deep. It goes so deep. It's maybe people want to induct the leadership into the competency framework, which is shallow. It's quite a kind of a shallow outcome, and we need to lead it deeper, and in a way establish the understanding of the trust, and that's where that comes in. And I guess where the control nature of organizations is often in the way of true intervention, is that actually what what we actually need to develop for people to adopt the competency framework and do that stuff, because that stuff is like, you know, obvious, is they need to discover their agency. And they need to discover responsibility. They need to understand something more deeply about their own relationship with their context. So there are deep outcomes that we are looking at. They need to become more present. But what does it mean to become present? It means, you know, become aware of your maladaptations. It becomes I often think that much of this work is, rather than putting stuff into people, it's stripping away stuff. I think so much of traditional development work is, you know, develop new stuff in people, train people in new skills, etc., etc. Whereas much of the work is perhaps perhaps more sort of negative capability. It's stripping away, and that's the process. The process reveals. It opens up and it reveals to people who they are, who they could be, what the organization could be, what the organization has become, that kind of thing, which is perhaps uncomfortable, and which is perhaps why. But I also think that if you don't do that, you might as well, you know, you might as well just go look for the cheapest provider. Because that stuff is so commoditized that, you know, like, teach people listening skills or problem solving. Go teach people problem solving. Going to teach them some agile practices. That stuff is completely commoditized and at a superficial level. Where's the transformation? And yeah. And that's where the intervention needs to work. And I guess that remains an interesting question, is can a standard, you know, 9 conversations in leadership, can it do that? And my view is it can, because it's been designed to work with the universal, not with the generic.
Cool. So we have 3 minutes. Does anybody have any concluding remarks or questions or comments?
I like the universal versus generic language. It's something that I'm taking away from this.
Hi. Sorry, it's
Yes,
Teresa
Teresa.
here. Hi there. Sorry, can I just jump in quickly? I'm sorry, it's right at the end.
Please do.
I just first want to say thank you for the insights and just sharing everything you have today. Obviously, the topic itself appealed to me because I'm dealing with transformation on a sort of different, more macro scale, and it's been very, very insightful to hear and to go back to kind of the organizational side of things. I'm just curious, you know, obviously for me now, I'm looking at more transformation across government, business, and communities, and looking at a more holistic approach to transformation. And I mean, I'd be keen to explore where does organizations fit in, and we've been working for 2 years on a model now that we want to scale across South Africa. And I mean, I know I'm familiar with 9 conversations, and I think there's huge value in that. But I also know there's complexities that is not currently touched on. Now that I've spent over 20 years in corporates and that kind of environment, and taking largely that learning into a very complex space where you're dealing with various stakeholders across the board, including corporates, corporates being part of it. So I know it's at the end now, but I'd love further conversations if possible around that sort of how do we engage business and leaders in that sort of different thinking outside of just the business, because there's so much happening now in the world where you can't almost separate the two.
Yeah, I hear you, Teresa. I would love to have this conversation because it really fascinates me. Because I do think there's at the particular juncture where we find ourselves, there's a whole bunch of different conversations that we really need to start having with each other. And I guess that's one of the reasons why we started rescoping a next version of 9 Conversations. We didn't want to just change the content. We wanted to rethink the movement through the landscape. And there's a whole bunch of different themes that have been emerging, like inclusion and diversity. Things that interest me very much is things around partnership, collaboration, and so on. So I'd be very curious to know from you, what are the kinds of, what are the almost the meta qualities, the meta skills, the meta learnings, what are those things that are emerging right now that we really need to pay attention to and make sure that through whatever process we are following, that has the opportunity to develop.
Thanks. Sorry, I'm working in a very challenging environment today, hence completely mute. The reality of our world today, my 5-year-old boss is coming in to interrupt me every 5 seconds.
Yes, exactly.
So please forgive the interruptions. No.
That's cool.
But I'd love to have more conversations about this. Sorry.
That's cool. We'll set up some time, Teresa, for a chat.
Yes, please. Sorry, I keep going from mute and off, but yes, please, let's do that. I'd love to hear more, because I think there's everything you've said is so relevant, and obviously my passion for OD stems from the work in organizations and being largely in the sort of traditional HR and then moving into transformation OD. But I also now work with the very people we work with in organizations in the communities where they live. And it's fascinating. It's fascinating because I'm finding that the divide between your kind of, the traditional, don't bring your personal life to work doesn't really exist anymore.
Yes. And how dare we? Because the personal is the political. And the organizational is inside our ecologies and the places where we live. So we must just, I also think we are at a point where we refuse to have this hard functionalist separation between organization and community. Good, but we'll chat to you. We'll connect.
Thanks.
Okay. A few people there.
Thank you, Natalie.
Thank you, everybody, for attending. We'll post this on YouTube soon. And we hope that you loved it and that you will be back for more. Everybody's got our contact details, so let us know if you want more conversations. Thank you, Christo.
Everybody.
Thank you. Thank you for challenging me and putting me to do this. I want to explore this more.
Roy,
work out this thing.
Tell everybody about scalable, the universal nature of group development.
It is possible.
It's possible. It's possible. We can actually, the big point about this is that if we get this right, we can reach much more people, much more quickly, and do really important fundamental transformations that are really, really very necessary right now. And I don't you know, up to now, OD intervention is often something that only corporates and the rich corporates can afford or do that. Part of the scalability of this is to make it available at other levels of the world where it's really necessary.
Cool. Thank you, everybody.
Cool. Bye-bye, everyone. It was really nice having this chat to you. Thank